Great, thanks, and hello, everybody. I'm Samir Shah, and I'm part of the cybersecurity portfolio marketing team here at Dell, along with Steve. It's our job to take all the disparate parts of security around Dell and bubble them up into one cohesive and comprehensive message. So I'm going to walk you through the reducing the attack surface portion. And as Steve mentioned, this is the top of the threat funnel. It is defensive in nature. So we talk about planning for cyber attacks as if they are inevitable and recovery and being ready to be resilient. But this is the part where we do everything possible to make ourselves the hardest target, most difficult target possible by minimizing vulnerabilities and entry points. So the way that we start the conversation with on that is next slide will go. Is by asking our customers to think about a couple of questions. And these questions are not exhaustive by any means, but there's some critical areas that we think that organizations should consider as they're looking to become that slim target. So first of all, have you replaced your perimeter-based model and headed towards continuous verification? So Steve talked about zero trust. Zero trust principles like this play a big role in reducing the attack surface, and we'll see that as we go along. But these days, it's a foundational element to evolve from perimeter-based security. Secondly, are you protecting against credential theft? As Steve mentioned, that's still a significant chunk of where cyber attacks originate. I've even seen some reports that are higher than the one that he showed, up to a third of attacks originating from some sort of credential, rather, threat or compromise. And if you think about organizations and how much they're evolving today with contractors coming and going, employees coming and going, password sharing, application sharing, there's a lot of this that's taking place with credentials not being protected. So that's something important that we look at and ask organizations that we work with to think about. And then supply chain. So we'll go into supply chain in a bit of detail, but it's critical these days to look at both the physical and digital supply chain. And we have seen, a lot of things lately that have highlighted this: exploding pagers and phones on the one hand. On the other, we've seen digital supply chain issues related to open source code. And so organizations, big and small, need to be thinking about their supply chain. And, Dell is obviously a huge, close to $100 billion corporation, and we've invested in this tremendous supply chain, and we have the resources to do all the verification. SMBs may not have that type of resource, but they're also utilizing to a higher degree, or to at least to an equivalent degree, third-party vendors and other solutions where the supply chain can get compromised. So it's important that we look at this from the standpoint not just of large organizations, but also a lot of SMBs. And one of the examples that I heard recently at an event was a dentist office getting hacked because this dentist had a lot of high net worth customer clients, patients coming through. And so they're a soft target. Their attack surface is pretty wide because they haven't, undergone these uh, elements and maybe don't think about it, don't have the resources. So it's critical for all sizes of organizations. Now, the stat that we show on the side, we commissioned a study about a year ago to take the temperature of ITDMs and get an understanding of where they are on a wide variety of topics, including all three of our practice areas. And IT leaders indicated that signed BIOS and firmware updates are critical to maintaining foundational security. And that was good to hear because it is something that we agree is important. It's something that we've built into a lot of our technology, as you can see in a minute. But so it validates that, but it's also not the entirety, and there's a lot more to reducing the attack surface that we'll take a look at. So on this slide, I want to talk about the strategies around reducing the attack surface. and then we'll move on to look at how those strategies are implemented into Dell products and services. But first and foremost, reducing the attack surface begins with understanding an individual organization's unique risk and vulnerabilities. And these tests that we've outlined at the top, whether it's looking at ransomware specifically, pen testing, vulnerability, or simulating attacks, this is where organizations get a feel for where they may have weaknesses and vulnerabilities specific to their environment. And what's important to point out here is that going back to the example of SMBs, which are kind of near and dear to my heart, they may not necessarily have the in-house capability to address these issues or to run these tests, but there are organizations that can help them do that from a third-party basis. The other big thing to remember about these tests is they're only as good as often as they're done. So it's not a one and done scenario. It has to be done routinely. Again, speaking to the continuing evolution, growth, shrink, change that takes place in organizations, all of that has implications for the attack surface, and all of that requires that the testing is done routinely. So it has to become a part of the psyop process.
Quick question, Samir. So we're talking
Yes.
about professional services type of service, or this is like an online service app that I run inside
So
my organization?
So a large organization has the ability to do it internally, but then there are third-party services that can assist with that. I am not aware off the top of my head of applications that you can buy off the shelf or apps or technology tools of that sort. I don't know if my colleagues know that, but it wouldn't surprise me if those tools are available. And if they're not, I would suspect that they're coming especially geared to the lower end of the market that may not be able to invest as heavily in personnel or professional services. Does that help?
Yeah, I got it. That you're pretty much speaking in general on what organizations should do to reduce their
Yep.
attack surface. Okay.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah, I'm not. This is not. I'm not necessarily advocating any particular service or product there. Now, these four columns that are displayed here in the middle of the slide are four areas that we think are critical to focus on when reducing the attack surface. So, supply chain is critical. It's one thing to look at physical supply chain, and that's very important, as we've seen. We have to ensure that products are manufactured and delivered safely. But a few months ago, there was that open source code vulnerability that Microsoft developer happened to find and patch before it could cause any damage. That was a good reminder that we also have to think about software development, digital supply chain, and ensure that those risks are also addressed. From this, hardening of systems and infrastructure, Steve talked about patch management or just some of these being education and practice driven. It's critical that some of these routine cyber hygiene activities are taking place on a routine basis. And on the one hand, it may seem kind of commonsensical, but on the other hand, when you think about the talent gap in cybersecurity, when you think about the understaffed and overworked SOC teams, the discipline falls when there's a million alerts to deal with and not a big enough team to deal with them. And so we are seeing a growing number of attacks that that exploit vulnerabilities that exist from just the lack of regular patching. So security and cyber hygiene extremely important to reducing the attack surface. From an infrastructure standpoint and endpoints, we look at building in robust security features, secure boot, root of trust, USB port management, just a handful. But it's important that the infrastructure that's being used is incorporating these elements. Now, many of these are industry standard, but then there's also the issue of interoperability between aspects of the portfolio and efficiencies that can take place there. Authentication brings us back to zero trust. So just multi-factor authentication alone can have a big impact on reducing the attack surface because it makes it so much harder to gain entry into systems. But again, going back to the same example of having to test universally, you also have to deploy MFA universally. One of the customer stories that we are highlighting for Cybersecurity Awareness Month is a major Spanish university, and they were the subject of the victim of a ransomware attack, which came through a lower level application, which was on the roadmap to have MFA deployed, but it hadn't been. It was student facing, single authentication, and that's the entry point that the attacker used. And so coming out of that attack, the university made sure that they have buttoned up MFA and implemented it across the board. But again, the first way that an attacker is going to look to breach MFA is to find the one system or application that they can get around that where it hasn't been implemented. Then the last section is containment measures, and these can blunt the impact of an attack. So network segmentation prevents attacks from moving laterally, and reduces the blast radius, and data encryption and isolation will bolster resilience and make it that much easier to recover. Next, I'd like to talk about how Dell has built some of the pieces that we just discussed into our infrastructure and endpoint portfolios. It's something that has taken place over a long period of time, continues to grow and evolve. But just starting with servers, and rather than reading these off individually, you can see that we've talked about a couple of them. USB port management is again something that we offer that's fairly routine and can be utilized pretty easily. But I want to talk about Silicon Root of Trust a little bit to go into more detail. Um, what that means is that the encryption key is burned into the silicon during the manufacturing process, which makes it immutable. And that's the encryption key that validates the BIOS. So embedding that into the hardware is the only way to make that immutable. And we burn read only encryption keys into our PowerEdge servers at the factory. So that's just one example of where we are building in root of trust into our portfolio.
Samir, remind me here. Are Dell servers built at Dell-owned facilities using essentially silicon components that are, I'm thinking about your supply chain, because of course the security of my supply chain buying from you is dependent upon your supply chain. Can you just address a little more of the ownership and provenance along that early stage before that BIOS root of trust gets burned?
Yeah, and I've got a whole slide on supply chain that I can cover, but I'll give you a preview. So we go all the way down to the component level. So first of all, there's robust supply chain supplier vetting process and ongoing maintenance of that to ensure that the suppliers are complying with the standards that we have. Then we can put digital encrypted signatures on the components so that when the product is received, you as the end user can validate that that component is exactly what was put into the machine when it was manufactured. So we have um, chain of custody, if you will, of those components from inception, from receipt at the Dell factory to installation, all the way to delivery.
But I'm trusting your supply chain to you, that you're looking after that supply chain. I don't get visibility into your supply chain previously.
That's essentially correct. But the tools that we put in place validate the entirety of the box. So we are basically taking ownership of that to you, and we're the kind of the throat to choke if something is um, compromised as a result of our manufacturing
I'm
process.
hoping you have a program that's a little stronger than that when it's the potential for nation state actors being my adversary here. And
Part of this is that it comes down to process and procedure from our security and resilience organization. There's a whole set of content you can find out online that describes some of this, and also will lead you to some of the places so you can personally attest to some of the things that you're seeing from Dell as well. It's not simply, hey, we've got this, don't worry, but there's robust levels of documentation out there as well. Accordingly, there's also things like various compliance documentation out there, things like a SOC 2 Type 2 or any of the other various types of certifications out there, which may or may not impact parts of the supply chain to, again, attest our commitment to that type of security.
And I'll just add one more thing, Samir, just before you get going. We also have a technology built into the overall Dell supply chain. If any one of our customers who buys an appliance, right, and our sellers can help you go through this, you check a box in the ordering process called secure component verification. And if you check that box, when we build the system, we upload to the cloud everything that went in there, from every hardware component and firmware version. And then we send you an encrypted key, and you're the only one with the key. So when you receive the device and you boot up the system, you can run this command and it lists out, and you can compare that list to the one in the cloud. And if it doesn't change, that means you got what you specifically
There's no post-assembly tampering.
If anything got tampered with, you can see something isn't quite right here. So I just want to mention that one, Samir.
You can see here some of the capabilities that are built in. There are process capabilities for network segmentation, cryptographic encryption for data in flight, control plane restriction. So from the networking side as well, cybersecurity is built in. Moving on to storage and hyperconverged, they do offer strategic technical implementation guide, or STIG, hardening. And just to put that in perspective, our PowerStore offering in STIG mode meets the requirements of US federal sites, and PowerStore is certified as a data storage controller on the DoD approved product list. So we've gone to lengths to meet the highest requirements there.
Hey, Samir, quick question. What STIG is that
Yep.
you're referring to?
The which STIG in particular?
Yes.
That I can't answer which STIG in particular.
Okay.
But
problem.
there is it results in meeting the requirements of the DoD product list. So we can find out more.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. So next on data protection, I'm going to let Brian cover this in more detail, but retention lock capabilities, dual authorization for sensitive commands, and data isolation are features that ensure that we're reducing the attack surface of the data protection appliances themselves. And then with regards to endpoint security, Dell is able to make the legally verified claim that we sell the most secure commercial PCs. Other manufacturers will also say that, but we can show a feature comparison checklist that validates that we have more features that result in that claim. And what makes those PCs so secure is a combination of the hardware security, like BIOS and firmware, secured component verification that Steve mentioned, and of course the highly secure supply chain. And then in addition to the features that are built into the box, we also have the ability to add on features and software that can increase these are optional, but they increase the security capability of the PCs as well. And then finally, I want to point out that the services that we offer here are also what were mentioned earlier. These are services we offer to our customers, but as Adam has pointed out in the past, running these tests also gives our customers the understanding of which of these features that are built in they need to either turn on or focus on, where their weaknesses may be. So the services are a way to work in concert with the hardware to reduce the attack surface across the infrastructure. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this common identity management solution that we have. And this is something that speaks to Dell's ability to create solutions that work across the portfolio together. So in this particular case, we're providing common security for identity management, capabilities such as single sign-on, MFA, privileged access management. So this isn't a product, but what it is it makes security management simpler by ensuring that Dell products work together. And MFA is a good example. So the group certifies there are a couple of flavors of MFA, for example, RSA Secure ID and CAC PIV to work with all of our infrastructure solutions so that the customer can standardize on a common MFA delivery. That means less need for resources on the customer's end and simplifies implementation. A common approach to security also enables flexibility and scalability. So this is just an example, one example of what this group does and the value that they can add and how it unifies our infrastructure portfolio. It also creates an incentive to use multiple aspects of the infrastructure together to achieve security across all.
So, Samir, so what I'm hearing is that with this, you guys are building validated designs. Is that the value add that you're bringing?
Validated designs that are uniform across the entirety of the infrastructure portfolio. So that you're implementing MFA in the same way across servers, storage,
Okay.
networking, etc. Does that help?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, great. All right, moving on. Let's do a little bit deeper dive on the supply chain. This is an area that Dell has invested heavily in. It's an area that not only have we created a very secure supply chain for ourselves, but we're also involved in the industry in developing standards and best practices. It's a great way for us to contribute leadership there, but at the same time, as we make the entirety of the supply chain more secure, that benefits everyone. So valuable from multiple standpoints. Now we look at the supply chain across four key areas that are listed here, and security is the fundamental piece, the preventative and detection control measures that are taking care of physical assets, inventory, IP, people, um, all of which are reducing opportunities for malware or counterfeit components to get into the system. Controls in this area range from things like drug testing employees and contractors, CCTV monitoring, to data security and least privilege access on all the volumes of data that are created every day through supply chain operations. Integrity speaks to ensuring safe delivery, the products operating as intended. Here we focus on supplier accountability and diligence to ensure that we're only working with the highest quality suppliers. The secure development lifecycle addresses digital supply chain, but also the way that our hardware is developed and ensuring security into that. It incorporates analytics, threat modeling, static code analysis, and testing. We also practice what we preach in terms of pen testing to stay ahead of risks that may impact us. Quality speaks to our QA process. It's how we ensure that components and devices function the way that they should. Secured component verification, as Steve talked about, is a good example. It gives the end user assurance that the components they received are the ones that were installed in the manufacturing process. Finally, resilience refers to our ability to keep operating despite disruptions that might occur. So, if a quote key supplier goes down, that doesn't mean that we are prevented from continuing operations. And a big facilitator of that is using AI and machine learning tools to forecast usage models, optimize inventory, detect anomalies. And then, of course, there's multiple layers of redundancy built in there in case a key supplier goes down. So that covers most of what I wanted to go through. I want to leave you with a real world example. But before I do that, I just want to say that what I'm hoping to illustrate here is that reducing the attack surface is about a combination of process, discipline, action, and activity on the part of security practitioners combined with built-in functionality and services where applicable. So it's the combination of all of that that helps to reduce the attack surface, and it's an ongoing process. So it's not that what the attack surface may look like in March is different than what it may look like in October, and so this is an ongoing process. But the example I want to leave you with goes back a few years to the WannaCry ransomware attack back in 2017, which exploited the Microsoft server message block vulnerability. Very broad attack, impacted something like 230,000 computers, 150 countries, billions of dollars in damage due to costs paid in ransom, as well as indirect costs and impacts. But Microsoft had sent out a patch 2 months prior, and organizations that ran that patch were not affected or affected very minimally. And one of those organizations is the Barts Health NHS Trust in the UK, and they run the patch and also shut down systems immediately when this attack began. So that goes back to vigilance and discipline, uh, and that minimized. They were very minorly affected. Now, contrast that with the NHS, the umbrella organization above them, was one of the hardest hit in this attack. Nearly 100 million pounds lost and 20,000 canceled appointments and surgeries. Now, also to put this in perspective, is in 2023 there was the Move It file transfer vulnerability. Still a big attack, still widespread impact, hit companies like Shell, the BBC, but due to better focus on patch management and network segmentation, the cost was in the hundreds of millions versus billions. So a massive improvement that we've seen over the years with a greater focus on some of these key aspects.